Listen carefully. I have an important and urgent message to release today. And I say this without hesitation. This message is not for everyone. If you are not walking the divine path of God, if you are not serious about your faith, if you are here only out of curiosity, this is not for you. You can leave now with no offense. But if you are a true follower of God, if you've felt different your entire life, if you've sensed that heaven has been training you quietly while others moved freely, then you are exactly who this message is meant for, and the fact that you are hearing this right now is not random. It reached you at the perfect time, right when your spirit needed clarity, right when your mind needed rest, right when your heart needed confirmation. Chosen one, you carry a kingdom clearance level that almost no one qualifies for. You have been trusted with access, insight, and responsibility that heaven does not hand out casually. And today, I'm going to explain why your life has unfolded the way it has, and what that clearance truly means for you. Stay with me till the end, because what I'm about to share will settle questions you've been carrying silently for years. Before we continue, chosen ones, give a like to this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, tap the bell icon, share this message with other chosen ones, and comment 777 below to declare that you are aligned with your divine assignment.
Understanding kingdom clearance, what it truly means in the spiritual realm. Now listen to me closely and let your spirit relax while your mind stays alert. When I say kingdom clearance level, I am not talking about status, titles, or spiritual ego. I am talking about authorization. I am talking about trust. I am talking about access that only comes when God has tested you in ways most people would never survive. In the natural world, clearance is not given to everyone. Not everyone gets access to sensitive rooms, classified information, or high-level decisions. It's the same in the kingdom of God. Clearance is never about favoritism, it's about capacity. God does not give deep access to shallow vessels. He gives access to those who have proven they can carry weight without breaking, leaking, or misusing it. Many people are called, very few are cleared. That's where most believers misunderstand the process. Being called means God noticed you. Being cleared means God trusts you. And trust is not built through talent, charisma, or public faith. Trust is built in private obedience, silent endurance, and seasons where you chose God, even when nothing made sense. Your clearance level explains why your life never followed a simple pattern. It explains why shortcuts were never available to you. Others could compromise and still move forward. You couldn't. Others could live loosely and still be celebrated. You couldn't. Every time you tried to step outside alignment, life shut down, not because God was punishing you, but because your clearance wouldn't allow contamination. Kingdom clearance is spiritual authorization to carry insight, influence, and responsibility that affects more than just you. That's why God trained your discernment early. That's why you've always sensed things before they happened. That's why certain environments drained you while others felt heavy without explanation. You weren't imagining it. Your spirit was responding to levels of access and atmospheres you were never meant to tolerate. Let me say something that will bring peace to your mind. Your struggles were not signs of delay, they were signs of depth. God was not slowing you down. He was strengthening your internal structure so that when access was granted, you wouldn't collapse under the pressure. People with low clearance live loud lives. People with high clearance live guarded lives. That's why God often kept you quiet, not hidden out of shame, but protected from exposure. You weren't overlooked, you were being preserved. Kingdom clearance also explains why you could never fully blend in, even in churches, even among believers. You could sense hypocrisy quickly. You could feel when words didn't match hearts. You were never comfortable with surface-level faith. That discomfort wasn't rebellion, it was discernment. And discernment is expensive. It isolates before it elevates. This clearance does not make you better than others, it makes you more accountable. God watches you closer, corrects you faster, convicts you deeper. That's why you felt inner pressure when others felt free. That's why your conscience wouldn't let you ignore what others brushed off easily. And here is where I want your heart to settle. God never gives clearance to harm you. He gives it to entrust you. He gives it because he knows you won't misuse power, twist truth, or abandon him when influence arrives. Heaven values integrity over visibility, always. Your clearance also means your assignments are layered. What you see is never the full picture. God reveals things to you in pieces because full revelation requires stability. If he showed you everything at once, the weight would crush you. So he teaches you patience, stillness, and obedience in fragments. You've probably asked God why your path feels stricter than others. This is why. Clearance requires discipline. Discipline builds authority. Authority protects others. You are being shaped not just to survive, but to carry responsibility without corruption. This is also why delay has been a teacher in your life. Waiting trained your emotional control. Silence trained your listening. Disappointment trained your detachment. You were learning to move without panic, speak without urgency, and trust without evidence. And hear me clearly now, your clearance is not about what you do, it's about who you are becoming. God is less interested in your speed and more invested in your stability. He knows when he releases you, people will listen. And when people listen, the weight increases. That is why your foundation had to be unshakable. So if your life felt heavier than most, it's because you were carrying more than most. If your training felt lonely, it's because clearance is rarely crowded. And if your spirit always knew there was more, it's because heaven placed a level of access inside you that could not activate until you were ready. Take a breath. Nothing about your journey was wasted. Nothing about your resistance was accidental. You weren't falling behind. You were being cleared. And now that you understand what kingdom clearance truly means, the next thing we must talk about is why almost no one qualifies and why the cost was so high for you. Let me add this, because this part is critical for your healing and your understanding. Kingdom clearance also means God had to strip illusions from you early. You could not afford to live deceived. You could not afford to chase fantasies, false identities, or borrowed visions. While others were allowed to experiment, wander, and delay their alignment, you were corrected quickly. That is why certain desires never fully satisfied you. That is why even success, when it came, still felt incomplete. Your soul was trained to recognize purpose over pleasure. You were also taught restraint before reward. God watched how you handled disappointment. He watched how you spoke when things were unfair. He watched how you treated people who misunderstood you. Clearance is tested in reactions, not revelations. Anyone can shout faith when life is good. Only the cleared remain anchored when life is silent. This is why God sometimes removed people without explanation. Not everyone in your life could survive your next level of access. Some would have leaked information. Some would have resented your growth. Some would have slowed your obedience. So God did what you couldn't. He separated quietly, painfully, precisely. And yes, there were moments you questioned yourself. Moments you wondered if you were imagining things. Moments you felt too intense, too deep, too serious. Let me calm your mind right now. You were not too much. You were just operating at a frequency most people were never trained to hear. Kingdom clearance sharpens perception. It heightens awareness. It makes you sensitive to what others ignore. That sensitivity is not weakness. It is spiritual intelligence. And once you understand that, you stop fighting yourself. You stop apologizing for depth. You stop shrinking your obedience. You begin to walk calmly, confidently, and quietly, knowing that heaven sees you clearly, even when people don't. And that understanding prepares you for the next truth, why the qualification process eliminated almost everyone else. Why almost no one qualifies. The hidden cost of divine access. Now let me speak to the part of your journey that most people never understand and never will. This is where many fall away. This is where the qualification process becomes too heavy, too uncomfortable, too demanding. And this is exactly why almost no one qualifies for the level of kingdom clearance you carry. God does not eliminate people randomly. He filters intentionally. The qualification process is not about intelligence, talent, or even how much scripture someone can quote. It is about endurance under pressure. It is about obedience when obedience costs you something real. Most people love God when blessings are visible. Very few remain loyal when obedience leads them into loss, isolation, or delay. You were qualified because you stayed. You stayed when prayers felt unanswered. You stayed when people misunderstood your silence. You stayed when walking away would have been easier than standing firm. Many started the journey with you. You remember them. Some were louder, some were more confident, some appeared more gifted. But when the pressure increased, when God began demanding surrender instead of comfort, they chose relief over refinement. The kingdom filters through pressure. Let me explain something that will calm your mind. God does not test to discover who you are. He already knows. Testing is for exposure, to reveal what cannot go forward. Every delay, every closed door, every season of being misunderstood was a filter, not punishment, not rejection, filtration. Most people fail the process because they want access without accountability. They want influence without submission. They want spiritual power without emotional discipline, and heaven will not allow that. Too much damage happens when unrefined people are given authority. That's why your process was slower, stricter, more demanding. You weren't being slowed down. Others were being filtered out. The hidden cost of divine access is that God removes what cannot survive where He is taking you. And removal hurts. It hurts because it often involves people you loved, dreams you were attached to, and versions of yourself you had to let die. This is why grief followed obedience in your life. This is why elevation came with loneliness. This is why clarity came after confusion. Clearance requires clean hands and a steady heart. And a steady heart is not formed in comfort. It is formed in contradiction, when life doesn't match the promise, yet you remain faithful anyway. Most people disqualify themselves emotionally. They become bitter. They become resentful. They begin blaming God instead of trusting His process. And bitterness always blocks access. Resentment contaminates authority. God will never give clearance to a wounded ego. You, however, were wounded, but you didn't harden. You questioned, yes. You struggled, yes. But you did not abandon God. You didn't trade faith for cynicism. You didn't turn pain into cruelty. That alone qualified you further than you realize. Another reason almost no one qualifies is because identity pressure breaks people. God begins stripping false identities early in the process. Titles, labels, social roles, none of that can survive kingdom clearance. And when those layers are removed, many feel lost, empty, unstable. You felt that too. You had seasons where you didn't know who you were anymore. The old version didn't fit. The new one hadn't emerged. That in-between space is where most quit. They run back to familiarity, back to noise, back to comfort, back to old patterns. But you stayed in the middle. You allowed God to redefine you slowly, painfully, quietly. That alone eliminated thousands. The process also exposed who could handle silence. God speaks less to those He is maturing more, not because He is distant, but because silence develops discernment. People addicted to constant reassurance cannot function at high clearance levels. They panic when God goes quiet. They seek validation from people. They rush decisions. You learned to wait. You learned to listen inwardly. You learned that peace is more valuable than answers. That discipline is rare. Another cost most cannot pay is obedience without applause. Many people serve God publicly but disobey privately. Heaven sees that. Clearance demands alignment in secret. What you do when no one sees matters more than what you do on display. That's why God watched how you handled obscurity, how you treated people who couldn't help you, how you responded when recognition never came. And let me say this clearly, your isolation was intentional. Too many voices disrupt clarity. God separated you not because you were better, but because your assignment required precision. Distractions would have diluted your obedience. This is also why God challenged your emotional attachments. Anything you needed too much could not go forward with you. Codependency blocks authority. Emotional addiction clouds discernment. So God trained you to stand alone emotionally, anchored in Him, not people. That training hurt, but it made you strong. Most people want God to fix their life. Few are willing to let God rebuild it. Fixing preserves structure. Rebuilding requires demolition, and demolition feels like loss before it feels like purpose. You survived demolition. That's why you qualify. And here's something important. Qualification does not mean perfection. It means submission. It means correction didn't make you defensive. Conviction didn't make you rebellious. Discipline didn't make you quit. You stayed teachable. You stayed humble. You stayed soft. That softness is strength in the kingdom. Now let me speak directly to the exhaustion you felt. The fatigue was not weakness. It was the cost of carrying responsibility before visibility. You were bearing weight long before you saw results. That kind of strain would have crushed unprepared minds. But you endured. And because you endured, heaven entrusted you with access that cannot be recalled easily. God does not promote impulsively. When He clears someone, He is confident they won't self-destruct when pressure increases. That's why your breakthrough will not look chaotic. It will not be loud. It will not be rushed. It will be stable. So when you look around and wonder why others seem to pass you by, remember this: many were never meant to go where you're going. They weren't rejected. They were redirected. Different assignments, different capacity, different clearance. Your path was narrow because it was specific. And now that you understand why almost no one qualifies, the next thing you need is confirmation. Not theory, not ideas. Confirmation through patterns, signs in your life that were never coincidence. Let me slow this down for a moment, because this part needs to settle gently into your spirit. Another reason almost no one qualifies is because God tests loyalty under invisibility. When there is no reward, no applause, no confirmation, only obedience. Many people can follow God when they feel Him strongly. Few can follow Him when they feel nothing at all. Silence exposes motives, and in silence, most people drift. You didn't. There were seasons where you showed up tired, where faith felt mechanical, where prayer felt heavy, yet you still showed up. That consistency under dryness is rare. God noticed it. Heaven recorded it. That alone elevated your clearance. Also understand this: high clearance requires emotional maturity. God will never entrust authority to someone who reacts instead of responds. That's why you were placed in situations that triggered you, not to break you, but to teach you control, to teach you restraint, to teach you how to stay grounded when provoked. You learned to pause instead of explode, to reflect instead of retaliate, to pray instead of panic. Most people fail here. They let emotions lead them, and emotion-led people cannot handle kingdom authority. Another hidden cost is surrendering timelines. God removed your need to rush. He slowed your impatience. He delayed outcomes so you wouldn't idolize speed. You learned that being early can be just as dangerous as being late. That wisdom only comes through waiting. And yes, there were moments you felt overlooked. Moments you wondered if obedience was worth it. Let me answer that clearly now. It was. Every quiet yes. Every unseen sacrifice. Every time you chose alignment over convenience, it all counted. Nothing was wasted. You weren't being punished. You weren't forgotten. You weren't behind. You were being qualified quietly, while others disqualified themselves loudly. And now, as we move forward, I want to show you something deeply personal. Patterns in your life that prove this clearance was always there. Signs you may have ignored, doubted, or minimized. But they were never coincidence. They were confirmation. Signs you carry this clearance, patterns that cannot be coincidence. Now let me speak gently but clearly. This is where many of you will feel deeply seen, not emotionally manipulated, recognized, because once you understand these patterns, you stop doubting yourself. You stop questioning whether you imagined your journey. You realize something sacred has been operating in your life all along. One of the first signs of kingdom clearance is that your life never allowed you to stay shallow. From an early stage, surface-level living felt empty to you. Small talk drained you. Entertainment without meaning bored you. Even joy had to be rooted in truth to feel real. That wasn't arrogance. That was depth. God wired your spirit for substance because shallow environments cannot hold kingdom responsibility. Another sign is that you've always felt internally guided, even when externally confused. There were times you couldn't explain why you didn't move when everyone else moved, or why you walked away from things that looked good on the surface. People called it fear. People called it hesitation. But deep down, you knew it was discernment. Something in you sensed danger before it arrived. That inner restraint protected you more times than you'll ever fully realize. You also noticed that life corrected you quickly. When you were out of alignment, even slightly, things stalled. Energy dropped. Peace left. Opportunities dried up. Not because God was harsh, but because your clearance required precision. Others could drift and still progress. You couldn't. Your spirit demanded alignment, and heaven enforced it. Another unmistakable pattern is that you've been misunderstood more than most. Not hated, misread. People projected onto you. They assumed intentions you never had. They felt threatened by your silence or intimidated by your depth. And no matter how kind or consistent you were, some never got you. That wasn't because you lacked clarity. It's because high clearance doesn't translate well to low awareness. You've also carried a strange blend of strength and sensitivity. You feel deeply, yet you endure quietly. You absorb more than you express. You sense emotional undercurrents in rooms and conversations that others miss completely. That sensitivity sometimes made you feel weak, but it's actually advanced perception. God trained your emotional intelligence so you could shepherd, guide, and protect without being reckless. Another pattern is that authority has always followed you quietly. Even when you didn't seek leadership, people listened when you spoke. Even when you weren't trying to influence, your words carried weight. Advice you gave lingered. Presence you brought shifted atmospheres. That authority didn't come from confidence. It came from clarity. Heaven-backed authority doesn't shout. It resonates. You may have also noticed that your life has been marked by cycles of isolation. Not isolation from bitterness, but separation for refinement. There were seasons where God pulled you away from noise, relationships, and distractions. At the time, it felt lonely. But in hindsight, those seasons recalibrated your soul. They strengthened your inner voice. They made you less dependent on approval and more anchored in truth. Another sign is that you've been required to heal faster than others. You didn't get the luxury of staying broken. Pain demanded resolution. Trauma demanded processing. God didn't allow you to live in denial. Healing was not optional. It was necessary. Clearance cannot coexist with unresolved wounds. So God taught you to face yourself honestly. You also experienced delays that didn't make sense naturally. You did everything right, yet things still took longer. Doors closed without explanation. Momentum paused unexpectedly. But those delays were not denial. They were alignment checks. God was synchronizing you with people, places, and timing that matched your clearance level, not just your desire. Another pattern is that you've been protected from certain paths you once wanted badly. Looking back now, you can see it clearly. What you thought was loss was actually rescue. What felt like rejection was actually redirection. God blocked outcomes that would have diluted your authority or compromised your peace. You've also felt a persistent inner pressure to live cleanly, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, not perfectionism, alignment. When something was off, you felt it immediately. Your conscience is sensitive because your assignment requires clarity. High clearance demands internal order. And let me say this gently. You've likely felt tired in ways rest alone couldn't fix. That fatigue wasn't physical. It was responsibility fatigue. You were carrying future weight before future visibility. You were processing things ahead of time, preparing internally for moments that hadn't arrived yet. That kind of exhaustion confuses people, but it makes sense in the kingdom. Another sign is that your faith deepened through disappointment. Hard seasons didn't push you away from God. They pushed you deeper into Him. You didn't abandon belief. You refined it. Your faith became quieter, stronger, less performative. That kind of faith is rare and trusted. You may have also noticed that God trained you to listen more than speak. Silence became familiar. Stillness became instructional. You learned that not every thought needs expression and not every insight needs an audience. That restraint is a sign of maturity and clearance. And finally, one of the clearest signs is this. You've always known there was more. Not in an ambitious way, in a quiet, settled knowing. A sense that your life wasn't random, that your struggles weren't pointless, that your endurance was leading somewhere specific, that knowing wasn't imagination, it was recognition. These patterns were heaven's fingerprints on your journey, evidence that your clearance was being formed long before it was explained. And now that you can see the signs clearly, the next thing we need to address is the pressure, the mental weight, the inner battles that came with carrying this level of responsibility, often without understanding why. Let me add this because some of you need reassurance right here. Another sign you carry this clearance is that you've always been internally self-aware, sometimes to the point of discomfort. You don't just feel emotions, you examine them. You question your motives. You reflect deeply after conversations, decisions, and reactions. That level of self-examination is not common. God built that into you so pride wouldn't take root when authority increases. You've also noticed that you rarely fit into systems that reward conformity over truth. Whether in workplaces, churches, or social circles, you sensed when structure mattered more than integrity. You tried to adapt, but something in you resisted compromising your values for acceptance. That resistance wasn't rebellion, it was alignment. Kingdom clearance refuses to bow to systems that silence truth. Another overlooked pattern is how your compassion runs deep, even when you've been hurt. You don't dehumanize people easily. You try to understand pain instead of weaponizing it. That mercy is dangerous in the wrong hands, but powerful in the right ones. God trained you to balance compassion with boundaries so your heart wouldn't harden under pressure. You may have also experienced moments where your spirit felt restless without explanation. Not dissatisfied, alert, as if something was approaching, shifting, or requiring readiness. That spiritual restlessness wasn't anxiety, it was anticipation. Heaven stirring you internally before external movement began. And finally, notice this. Despite everything you've endured, you're still here, still believing, still seeking truth, still choosing alignment. That alone confirms something most people overlook. If you weren't built for this level of responsibility, the process would have broken you completely. But it didn't. It refined you. You didn't lose your humanity. You didn't lose your faith. You didn't lose your compassion. That balance is rare, and it proves that what you carry isn't accidental. It's intentional, designed, cleared. Now, with these signs recognized and settled, it's time to address the part that's been hardest to carry. The mental pressure, the internal battles, the psychological weight that came with being chosen before being understood. The psychological weight of the chosen. Why your mind has been under pressure. Now let me speak to your mind, because your spirit has carried truth for a long time, but your mind has been under strain. And I want you to hear this slowly, without judgment, without fear. What you've been experiencing is not weakness. It is weight. Chosen ones do not just carry spiritual assignments. They carry mental responsibility long before they carry visible results. And when the mind is exposed to pressure without explanation, it begins to question itself. That's why there were moments you wondered if something was wrong with you. Nothing was wrong. You were processing things ahead of time. One reason your mind has been under pressure is because you've always been aware before you were ready. You sensed problems before they surfaced. You anticipated outcomes before others noticed patterns. That level of awareness creates mental fatigue. Seeing ahead is exhausting when you're still required to walk step by step. Your mind was trained to observe, analyze, and discern continuously. And while others could turn their thoughts off, you couldn't. That wasn't overthinking, it was vigilance. God was sharpening your perception, but perception without context can feel like anxiety. That's why rest often felt incomplete. Sleep didn't always restore you, because the fatigue wasn't physical, it was cognitive and spiritual. Another pressure came from emotional containment. You felt deeply, but you didn't always express freely. You learned early that not everyone could hold your truth safely, so you carried it internally. Over time, that internalization created mental heaviness, not because you were hiding, but because you were protecting what was sacred. You also carried the pressure of responsibility without authority. You sensed calling, purpose, and expectation, but without position or permission. That creates internal tension. The mind wants to move forward, but wisdom restrains it. Living in that tension for long periods stretches the psyche. Many people break there. You didn't. Another mental strain came from constant self-correction. You held yourself to standards others didn't even notice. Your conscience spoke loudly. When you misaligned, you didn't ignore it. You adjusted. That internal discipline is rare, but it's tiring. Correction before consequence saves you later, but it costs you energy now. Let me also address something important. Your mind was tested through contradiction. God allowed situations where what you believed didn't match what you experienced. You believed in justice, but saw unfairness. You believed in faithfulness, but experienced abandonment. That tension forces the mind to mature. Immature faith collapses under contradiction. Mature faith deepens. You were also pressured by silence from God. Not abandonment, silence. God withheld explanations while still expecting obedience. That stretches trust. And when trust stretches, the mind aches. You questioned, you wrestled, you sought clarity. But you stayed. That endurance built mental stability, even when it didn't feel like it. Another reason your mind felt heavy is because you were shedding old identities. Identity shifts are mentally exhausting. When who you were no longer fits, but who you're becoming hasn't fully emerged, the mind feels unanchored. That's not confusion, that's transition. You also experienced pressure because you couldn't lie to yourself. Denial never worked for you. Distraction didn't last. You were forced to confront thoughts, emotions, and truths others avoided. That self-honesty is painful, but powerful. It builds integrity at the mental level. Let me normalize something else. Chosen ones often experience cycles of burnout without overwork. You weren't doing too much. You were carrying too much internally. Processing, discerning, anticipating, restraining. That kind of mental labor is invisible, but heavy. And here is where I want your mind to rest. You were never meant to carry this weight alone forever. This pressure was temporary. Training pressure, conditioning pressure, not permanent residence. God was strengthening your mental endurance so that future responsibility wouldn't destabilize you. He was teaching you how to stay calm while holding complexity, how to remain grounded while seeing multiple layers of truth. That's why chaos around you never fully entered you. That's why crises didn't destroy your core. That's why your faith survived contradiction. You were being trained to lead with clarity, not panic. Let me speak peace into your mind now. You don't need to figure everything out. You don't need to carry tomorrow today. You don't need to prove your worth through exhaustion. Your mind has been under pressure because it was being prepared, not punished. And now, as we move forward, there is one more truth you need to understand deeply. Why God often keeps people like you hidden, silent, and unseen before elevation. Let me go deeper here, because this is where many of you have quietly suffered without language for what you were experiencing. Another reason your mind has been under pressure is because you were living with unanswered questions for too long. Not small questions, existential ones. Questions about timing, about justice, about why obedience didn't immediately produce peace. When the mind seeks meaning and doesn't receive instant clarity, it creates internal friction. But that friction wasn't meant to break you, it was meant to stretch your capacity to trust without control. You were also carrying anticipatory weight. Your spirit sensed responsibility ahead of time, but your life had not yet caught up. Living ahead of your season creates mental tension. It's like being mentally prepared for a role you haven't stepped into yet. That gap between readiness and release is psychologically demanding. You were holding space for a future you couldn't yet touch. Another pressure point came from empathy overload. You didn't just feel your own emotions, you felt the emotions of others. You absorbed atmospheres. You carried concern for people who never knew how deeply you cared. That kind of emotional permeability is exhausting, if not understood. And for a long time, you didn't understand it. You thought you were too sensitive. You weren't. You were perceptive. You were also mentally strained because you couldn't afford escapism. Distractions that worked for others never worked for you. Numbing behaviors didn't satisfy you. Avoidance didn't last. God wouldn't allow you to disconnect from yourself. So you stayed present, even when presence was painful. That level of consciousness is heavy, but it produces wisdom. Let me address the internal dialogue you've had, the self-questioning, the moments where you replayed conversations, the nights where your thoughts felt louder than the room. That wasn't instability, that was integration. Your mind was trying to reconcile calling with reality, faith with experience, patience with desire. Integration takes time, and during that time, discomfort is normal. You also experienced pressure because you were being trained to self-regulate. God was teaching you how to calm yourself without external reassurance, how to stabilize internally when no one was validating you, how to find peace without resolution. That skill is rare and priceless at higher levels of responsibility. And let me say this gently. There were moments you felt close to emotional exhaustion, not because you were weak, but because you were carrying hope without evidence. Hope is heavy when it stands alone, yet you carried it anyway, quietly, faithfully. That kind of hope matures the mind like nothing else can. I want to reframe something for you now. The pressure you felt was not a sign you were doing something wrong. It was a sign you were being expanded internally. Expansion hurts before it stabilizes. Growth stretches before it strengthens. You were not losing your mind. You were learning how to hold more truth. And now that pressure is easing. Not because the calling disappeared, but because your capacity increased. You are calmer now, more grounded, less reactive. That is evidence that the training worked. Your mind didn't break. It adapted. It matured. And that prepares you for the next truth. Why God often keeps those he trusts most hidden, silent, and unseen until the moment exposure becomes safe. Authority without noise. Why God keeps you hidden before elevation. Now let me settle something that has bothered you for a long time. This quiet season, this hiddenness, this feeling of being ready yet unseen. I want you to understand this clearly. God hides what he values most until it is strong enough to stand exposed. In the kingdom, visibility is not favor. Stability is favor. God never rushes exposure for those carrying real authority. Noise attracts attention, but it also attracts interference. And you, chosen one, were never meant to grow under constant observation. You were meant to grow rooted, not reactive. That is why God kept you behind the scenes while others were promoted loudly. Hiddenness is not delay. It is containment. Authority that matures too fast collapses under pressure. Influence without identity becomes corruption. God knows this. So he chose the slower, safer route with you. While others were being shaped publicly, you were being shaped privately, and private shaping lasts longer. You may have noticed that every time attention came too early, something felt off. Either peace left or confusion entered, or the opportunity dissolved. That wasn't failure. That was protection. Your spirit knew exposure before readiness would cost you more than it gave. God hides his trusted ones because hidden environments reduce ego and sharpen obedience. When no one is watching, motives are revealed. You learn to obey without being seen, to be faithful without recognition, to remain aligned when applause was absent. That kind of integrity cannot be faked, and it cannot be rushed. Another reason God kept you hidden is because noise distorts discernment. Too many opinions, expectations, and voices dilute clarity. You needed silence to hear God clearly. You needed distance from crowds to recognize truth without influence. That's why certain social doors closed. That's why God limited your circle. Not to punish you, but to protect your clarity. You were also hidden because your authority is internal first. God always builds authority inwardly before releasing it outwardly. Confidence rooted in calling, not validation. Calm rooted in identity, not outcomes. When authority is internal, it doesn't collapse when circumstances change. People who rise quickly often fall loudly. People who rise quietly remain steady. God chose steadiness for you. Another truth you need to hear: God hides people who would be attacked prematurely. Not everyone wants truth. Not everyone celebrates clarity. Some resist it. Some envy it. Some try to dismantle what they don't understand. God knew that if you were exposed too early, you would spend energy defending instead of building. So, he kept you concealed. Hiddenness also trained you to lead without needing control. When you have no platform, no title, no influence, all you have is character. And character is what sustains authority when power arrives. You learned patience. You learned restraint. You learned how to let God fight battles instead of forcing outcomes. Let me address something directly. You sometimes felt invisible, overlooked, underutilized. And yes, that hurt. But invisibility did not diminish your value. It preserved it. Gold is not stored on shelves. It is locked away, secured, guarded. God guards what carries weight. Another reason for hiddenness is this: God was removing performance from your obedience. When no one is watching, obedience becomes pure. You stop doing things to be seen and start doing them because they are right. That purity is required at higher clearance levels. You also learned how to self-govern, without constant direction, without external structure. God was teaching you how to manage your thoughts, emotions, and reactions independently. That's leadership training. Leaders who need constant supervision cannot carry authority safely. Hiddenness also prepared you for delayed gratification. You learned not to panic when progress wasn't visible, not to rush when outcomes weren't immediate. That patience will protect you when influence increases and pressure multiplies. And let me say something that may surprise you. God often hides people to protect others from them. Authority before humility damages lives. Insight before maturity wounds people. God ensured that when you finally step forward, you will lead with compassion, not arrogance, with wisdom, not impulse. You were hidden until your heart softened enough to carry truth without harming others. Another layer of hiddenness is this: God was detaching you from the need to explain yourself. You learned to let misunderstandings exist, to let people think what they wanted. That detachment is strength. Leaders who need to be understood by everyone lose clarity quickly. You learned silence. You learned restraint. You learned to trust God's timing over public opinion. That is rare. And here is the most important part. Hiddenness does not last forever. It lasts until exposure becomes safe. When God releases you, It will be with alignment, not chaos. With confirmation, not confusion. With peace, not panic. You won't need to announce your arrival. Authority announces itself. People will recognize it without explanation. Doors will open without force. Influence will come without manipulation. And because your foundation is deep, your elevation will be stable. So stop questioning the quiet. Stop resenting the silence. Stop comparing your path to louder ones. Your authority was never meant to be noisy. And now that you understand why God kept you hidden, the next truth is critical. How to walk with this level of clearance without burning out, losing yourself, or carrying weight that was never meant to be permanent. Let me add this final layer because it brings peace to something you've quietly wrestled with. Hiddenness also trained you to trust God's voice over your own urgency. There were moments you wanted to move, speak, act, or correct situations, but something in you held back. That restraint wasn't fear. It was wisdom forming. God was teaching you that timing is as important as truth. A word released too early can damage what it was meant to heal. You also learned how to stand without support. When encouragement was scarce and affirmation was absent, you learned to stabilize yourself internally. That self-stability is essential. People who rely on constant validation crumble when leadership becomes lonely. You learned how to keep going without applause. That is not small. That is rare strength. Hidden seasons also exposed false urgency. You realized that rushing does not equal obedience. Speed does not equal faith. Sometimes waiting is the highest form of trust. That understanding settled your spirit. It slowed your reactions. It matured your decisions. You stopped forcing outcomes and started allowing alignment. And here is something deeply important. Hiddenness protected your authenticity. You didn't have to perform. You didn't have to impress. You didn't have to maintain an image. You were free to become real, whole, honest. That authenticity will be your greatest asset when visibility arrives. You were hidden long enough to know who you are without an audience. You were unseen long enough to know your worth without recognition. That means when people finally see you, you won't lose yourself trying to keep them. So let your heart rest here. Nothing about your quiet was accidental. Nothing about your delay was wasted. You were being strengthened, softened, and aligned all at once. And now, because you understand the weight, the authority, and the process, the final thing you need is guidance. How to walk forward with this clearance in peace, not pressure. With confidence, not exhaustion. That's what we'll talk about next. How to walk with this clearance without burning out or losing yourself. Now we come to something very practical, and I want you to listen to this part slowly because this is where many chosen ones struggle, not because they lack faith, but because they carry too much without boundaries. Kingdom clearance does not mean constant strain. It does not mean exhaustion is your proof of obedience. God did not refine you so you could live overwhelmed. He refined you so you could walk grounded. The first thing you must understand is this: obedience is not urgency. You were never asked to rush. Rushing creates anxiety, and anxiety clouds discernment. High clearance requires calm movement. When God wants you to move, you will feel clarity, not panic. Pressure that comes with fear is not divine. God leads with peace, even when the assignment is heavy. You must learn to protect your inner stillness, not silence for isolation, but stillness for alignment. Your peace is not optional. It is a safeguard. If something costs you your peace, pause before proceeding. High-level authority requires emotional regulation. You don't react, you respond. Another key is learning to release responsibility that isn't yours. Just because you can perceive, help, fix, or guide does not mean you are assigned to. Discernment without boundaries leads to burnout. You are trained to see, but not to carry everything you see. Ask yourself often, is this mine to hold or mine to release? You also must walk with discernment in relationships. Not everyone deserves access to you. Proximity is earned, not assumed. This is not arrogance, it is stewardship. High clearance requires limited access, not secrecy, selectivity. You are allowed to say no without guilt. You are allowed to step back without explanation. God will never require you to overextend yourself to prove love. Another truth you must accept is this: rest is not a reward, it is a discipline. Chosen ones often struggle to rest because they associate stillness with stagnation. But rest is where clarity sharpens. Rest is where strength is restored. Even God rested, not because he was tired, but because completion requires pause. You must also stop trying to carry tomorrow today. Future responsibility does not require present anxiety. God reveals in stages because capacity is built progressively. Stay in today, obey today. Tomorrow will come with grace designed for it. One of the healthiest things you can do is learn to let God open doors instead of forcing outcomes. Forced doors drain you. Aligned doors energize you. If something requires constant struggle, manipulation, or compromise, it's not time yet. God's timing does not exhaust your soul. It strengthens it. You also need to walk in humility without self-erasure. Humility does not mean shrinking. It means staying teachable. It means remaining open to correction without losing confidence. You can walk boldly without becoming rigid. You can be strong without becoming harsh. Another safeguard is learning to release control. High clearance doesn't mean you manage everything. It means you trust God with outcomes. Control is often a response to fear. Trust is a response to alignment. You don't need to micromanage your calling. God is invested in it more than you are. Let me speak to your mind again. Stop rehearsing what hasn't happened yet. Overthinking is not preparation. It's anticipation without rest. Preparation is intentional. Overthinking is exhausting. When your thoughts start spiraling, ground yourself in what is real, present, and within your reach. You also need to understand that you are allowed to evolve. Who you were during training is not who you are now. Release old expectations of yourself. Release outdated identities. Growth requires permission to change. You don't owe consistency to anyone except God. Another vital practice is staying connected without being consumed. Stay informed, but not overwhelmed. Stay compassionate, but not depleted. You don't need to absorb everything to be effective. You don't need to feel everything to be faithful. And here is something that will protect you deeply. Keep your spiritual life simple. Complexity feeds ego. Simplicity feeds clarity. Prayer does not need performance. Faith does not need noise. God meets you in sincerity, not sophistication. Finally, remember this: your value is not measured by output. You are not more loved when you do more. You are not less called when you pause. God chose you for who you are becoming, not for how much you produce. So walk gently, move intentionally, rest without guilt. You don't need to carry this calling perfectly. You need to carry it faithfully. And now, as we come to the final moment of this message, I want to leave you with confirmation, not instruction, assurance, peace, a reminder of why you were trusted in the first place. Final confirmation and blessing. You were trusted for a reason. Chosen one, let me leave you with this truth settled firmly in your spirit. You were trusted on purpose. God does nothing casually. He does not guess. He does not experiment with souls. If you carry this level of kingdom clearance, it is because heaven weighed you, tested you, and found you faithful enough to entrust. You were not overlooked. You were not delayed. You were not forgotten. You were being prepared with precision. Everything you endured shaped stability in you. Everything you questioned sharpened discernment in you. Everything you survived strengthened humility in you. God chose you not because you were flawless, but because you were willing. Willing to stay soft, willing to stay obedient, willing to keep believing even when understanding was incomplete. Let your mind rest now. You are not behind. You are exactly where alignment placed you. The next season will not require striving. It will require trust. What is coming will meet you with peace, not pressure. with clarity, not confusion. You don't need to announce yourself. You don't need to prove your calling. You don't need to compete with anyone. What God releases through you will speak for itself. So walk forward calmly. Guard your peace. Stay rooted. Heaven knows your name. Heaven honors your endurance. And heaven will open doors at the right moment, without force. Before we close, chosen ones, if this message resonated with your spirit, give a like to this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, tap the bell icon, and share this with other chosen ones who need this confirmation. And comment 777 below as a declaration that you are aligned, ready, and trusting God's timing. Stay steady, stay faithful. Your clearance was never a burden, it was a calling.